It's Berlin briefing time, everyone, and we're getting dangerously close to Election Day on the 23rd of February here in Germany. We were going to talk about the economy today, and we will after these upcoming elections. But that debate just got overshadowed when the current front-runner Friedrich Merz dropped a bombshell. And now we have a debate on the firewall against the far-right AfD party. That's taken over the entire campaign. So today we'll look at what actually happened when Friedrich Merz accepted votes from the far right to get a motion passed in Parliament, whether this could still stop him on his now a bit more bumpy path towards becoming Germany's next Chancellor, and what Angela Merkel has to do with it all. With me is Justus Bender from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung here in Germany, who predicted exactly the scenario we're seeing now in 2017 when he wrote a book about what the far-right AfD actually wants. And with me in the studio is Matthew Moore, who watches the AfD for us very, very closely. And first of all, I want us to listen to Friedrich Merz. This is what he said in response to an attack by a rejected asylum claimant from Afghanistan who killed a 2-year-old child and a 41-year-old man. Here's his statement announcing that he wants to take anti-migration legislation to Parliament now, a plan that would see rejections at the border.
I don't care at all who joins this political path. I am just saying it is the only way I will go. And whoever wants to join me will have to stick to these 5 points. Compromises on these issues are no longer possible.
So, Matt, those 5 points included rejecting people at the German border. He instantly got a lot of criticism. He really changed his tone there. And then he took his motion to Parliament. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, so, I mean, the other big thing among his 5 points is the permanent border controls at Germany's borders. So those two things, the reason that really was significant was he was basically saying for the first time, I'm going to put this in front of Parliament and I don't care who votes. And that was really the message there was, even if the AfD were to vote with me, then so be it. It was an attempt, I think, to basically get the Greens, the Social Democrats, the other parties in the middle to say to them, are you willing to go the course that I'm on and vote with me? Because if not, I'm willing to go. I'm willing to get votes from elsewhere. And it was a huge moment, and I think it really changed the election campaign. Actually,
it did. I mean, the AfD has voted with motions and with legislation from other parties before, but this was the first time where they were needed to get something across the finish line to actually get a majority. Now, there was a huge debate in Parliament, a huge public debate here, and everybody was waiting with bated breath what this would do to the polling. So, has it harmed him?
Well, the polls have just come out this evening. There's a national poll, and I would say the two big winners are the CDU and the AfD, because both parties have gained a point, right? It's not major change, but it's certainly not the kind of the slide down the polls that people had predicted because of this gamble that Friedrich Merz had taken. So I think ultimately they'll be breathing a big sigh of relief at the CDU tonight.
So, Justus Bender, this sounds like it's political inside baseball, potentially. You wrote about this in 2017 in your book about what the AfD wants. Did it just get exactly what it wants, and what will be the impact?
Well, not exactly what I wrote in my book. I was just writing a scenario how the AfD could govern without reaching 50%, and the higher the AfD gets in the polls or in elections, the more unstable other coalitions become, because they have to form coalitions beyond the borders of ideological consensus. And then the AfD becomes even more stronger because other parties are fighting among each other. And this is kind of what's happening right now in Germany.
Yeah, the AfD is still polling at around about 20%. Friedrich Merz keeps stressing that he wouldn't actually cooperate with them. The Social Democrats of the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz are accusing him of already doing that by factoring in AfD votes and securing a majority. How does this change the equation if we're looking at the actual election outcome?
Well, if the CDU loses more percentage points now, it becomes really dangerous because then they would lose the ability to form a two-party coalition with either the SPD or the Green Party. And if we would look in the next few months at a forming coalition, a so-called Kenya coalition of the CDU, SPD, and Greens, it would be again a three-party coalition, which is extremely unstable, extremely unfavorable, and nobody actually wants it. And it would be a golden opportunity for the EFD to say, look at the establishment, they cannot get it done. They are unwilling and unable. And we will see, or we would probably see further gains in the polls and maybe even a coalition that collapses after a certain amount of time, and then new elections and an AFD that is much, much stronger than it is now.
Well, many politicians, when you speak to them, they're pointing towards 2029 as seen as the next elections where the AFD could then no longer be a party that is completely isolated. If they were to gain hugely, it could become too big to be ignored by other parties, which currently is the case. That's what this firewall is all about. It's an agreement of non-cooperation. Now, Friedrich Merz, certainly his opponents say, has broken this promise. Has he really? And what was that debate like?
Depends whether you believe Friedrich Merz or you believe as the opposition. So I think it's worth just like rewinding a bit. So he said, I'm going to put this motion. It's not a law, but he says, I'm going to put this motion. It's basically a statement of intent. This is what I'm going to do. If you vote for me on migration, this is what Germany needs. He says, I'm going to put this in front of the parliament. And if it gets the AfD votes, then so be it, right? That was last week. He then realised he might get the AfD's vote. So what did he do, Michaela? He said, I'm going to write in something in the motion that criticises the AfD, says that they're populist, that they're conspiracy theorists, and that will stop them from voting for it. The AfD on Monday morning came in and said, we would probably still vote for this actually because we're so firmly behind this change in migration law and toughening migration rules that we will still vote for this. That meant that Friedrich Merz was in a really kind of tricky situation, I think, because his gamble was, if I basically take this issue from the AfD, I can kill that party over the long term because they'll have a centre-right party that deals with this issue. What was interesting was I was in a meeting of the AfD on the Monday, and you know what they said? They said, this is the most exciting week we've had since we got into Parliament, because for the first time they thought, here's an opportunity for us to break this taboo, this firewall, where we can be the decisive votes in Parliament. And so there was a sense of excitement there on their part, and I think right now they're probably a week later, 10 days later, looking at the polls thinking, we've gained a point, we're still in very much part of the debate. Friedrich Merz is on the kind of the ropes, because it looks like, in some polls he's down, some polls he's up, but essentially there's people within the party who are criticising. We'll get to that in a moment. But they're feeling quite confident, I would imagine, because they think that this is the gateway. The door has just been opened slightly to potentially to, in some point in the future, for them to be part of a government in Germany.
I mean, it was certainly the most abrasive debate I've seen in the more than 3 years in this parliament. And of course, we always go to these briefings of the individual parties, and the Conservative CDU concern was that the AfD could take their own legislation and table it essentially in Parliament with an AfD label on top, and then put the Conservative CDU in a position where they either reject their own legislation because the AfD is bringing it forward, and or they would see themselves having to vote with them. So I just want to take this to you, Justus. I mean, is this all political theatre? Is this all part of the problem of something that actually helps the AfD in the end?
Well, I think it mostly is because the CDU did not see coming that the AfD was actually allowed to take their own legislation and introduce it into Parliament. Even I talked to members of Parliament from the CDU, and they said this was a very smart move by the AfD. And if you look at this whole gamble that Friedrich Merz committed to, he actually lost at that point because the AfD was a bit smarter. They threatened to introduce the CDU legislation and actually blackmailed them into the position where they were in them. So this was a very unfortunate situation for the CDU.
Well, what was also particularly unfortunate for Friedrich Merz is that Angela Merkel, from his own conservative CDU party, came out with a written statement essentially describing what he did as a mistake, quoting Friedrich Merz back to himself essentially as someone who had committed to not seeking a majority with the help of the AfD party. And then just over a week later, she was for the first time on a public stage, and she got what should be a very simple question, whether she prefers Robert Habeck, who's the Green Chancellor candidate and the current Vice Chancellor in this current government, or Friedrich Merz. And this is how she answered what should have been a very simple question.
I am now a CDU member. I am above all convinced that the CDU, in terms of the economic tasks... No, hold on. I have to... Not Robert. When I think about the economic future of our country, if it's between Merz or Habeck, then I have to say Merz. But I wanted to give a reason for that. I think we have huge economic challenges ahead, and I have a lot of confidence in the CDU.
Matt, it took her 25 seconds to answer that question.
It's incredible. Just incredible that she, clearly the kind of the pain that she has to bring herself to say, vote for the guy that succeeded me. I think really, really worth emphasizing just how extraordinary it is what she did last week, where she put out a statement. No one kind of went to her door and asked her what she thought about it. She put out a statement on her own website saying he's broken his promise, and to do that in the middle of an election campaign is extraordinary. What I find really interesting is that actually, when you look at the polls today, it hasn't made a big difference. That people, and when you poll people on Friedrich Merz's plan, they back him, and I think that, you know, for all the criticism, he clearly has a sense, an instinct that people in Germany want to see change on this issue, and I'm going to do it even if it means breaking a taboo or if it means upsetting Angela Merkel.
Yeah, and Angela Merkel wasn't really part of this campaign. There was a very civilized 70th birthday party for her, a bash that her own CDU party threw for her. Friedrich Merz, as the leader of that party, held a very civilized speech. But it's an open secret that they really don't get on at all. They haven't for a very long time. And Friedrich Merz left politics altogether because he lost out to Angela Merkel in the early 2000s. And this turned into somewhat of a political feud, because it's also remarkable that when you listen to Friedrich Merz, he keeps talking about his own party's mistakes while they were in government. So that is very thinly veiled criticism of Angela Merkel. I just want to throw this back to Justus. I mean, is this also something that could help the far-right AfD party, not just watching the Big Ten parties tear each other apart, but also the rifts, the self-criticism within themselves?
Yeah, probably. What really doesn't help them would be if the parties of the centrist democratic parties would unite and actually solve the problems that the country has. But they don't, and they fuel the pessimism among the AfD voters. This is really their main trait. It's not some socioeconomic situation they're in, but it's their pessimism. They believe that Germany is going down. They believe Europe is ahead of heading towards a catastrophe, and they don't believe in the establishment finding a solution. So the more the establishment feeds into this narrative, and the more they prove that they cannot find a solution, or even don't even see the possibility of a solution, because there are laws against it and there are courts against it, and regulations by the European Union, the more they will vote for the AfD. So I think the only chance the centrist parties have is really unite and look for a solution.
And I just want to map out why the AfD is being isolated here in Germany through what is an agreement that is called the firewall towards the right, just to illustrate that even the far right Marine Le Pen in France feels that the AfD is too extreme. In parts, it is being very closely watched by German intelligence services because it is suspected in parts of trying to undermine democracy here, and its youth organization just dissolved itself over fear of potentially being ruled against the law. So that is the back story to that. And ever since this tumultuous scenes in German parliament, Friedrich Merz, the conservative lead candidate to become the next chancellor, saw himself on the defensive over his very actions. He's said exactly what you're about to hear at his CDU party conference at least dozens of times into all cameras here in Germany. Let's take a listen.
We are not cooperating with this party. That was not the case last week, and that will not be the case this week or next week or the one after that. We won't tolerate them either. We won't hold any talks with the AfD. Nothing.
So that's what he reiterated to me when I interviewed him at that party conference. Matt, why does the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz from the Social Democrats say he doesn't believe him? He even says that Friedrich Merz is planning to have a coalition with the far-right AfD party.
Well, that was the risk that Friedrich Merz was taking last week. So we talked about the gamble, right? And the risk was that people would then start to ask questions about how committed he is to not working with the AfD. And so since doing that, we've had lots and lots of people asking that question. You've had senior people from the CDU leaving the party because they felt that he had broken the taboo by allowing the votes of the AfD to get his motion over the line in Parliament. That was somehow a willingness. If you're going to do it on something that's not even legally binding, that it's essentially a statement of your political intent, then what would stop you doing it should you become the Chancellor? And you do need to get your migration proposals through Parliament. What would stop you then accepting the votes of the AfD then? And it's a valid question, but what it meant is that the Friedrich Merz is then talking about his willingness not to work with the AfD and instead of talking about the economy or talking about the migration policies that he thinks are important for the country. So that was the risk he was taking. But what we've seen, I think, in the polls so far is that there hasn't been the kind of the damage to the polls so far, which I think he will be grateful for, and it will give him a lot of confidence in the next week. And one of my friends I messaged who's in the CDU, I said to him, what do you make of the polls? And he says he was very skeptical, my friend, right? He was skeptical of Merz, and he said, let him cook, which if you're young, means I wasn't really sure, but it seems to be working out, so just let him keep going. So there's people in the party now who will be looking at the polls going, okay, I wasn't sure, but maybe he's on the right way. Maybe he's on the right course.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that he's still at just above 30%, so that is still a pretty safe path to make the conservative CDU-CSU the strongest party. The Social Democrats, who are currently leading the government with Olaf Scholz, are just around about 14-15%. And this is how Olaf Scholz tried to change the course of this election campaign and say what he felt after this tumultuous week these elections are really about.
There must not be a majority for the CDU, CSU and the AfD after the elections, or we will be threatened with a coalition of these two parties in Germany. Because someone who says, I don't care who votes for my motions, they will also end up saying, I don't care who votes for me.
Justus Bender, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that I would think that the CDU is very sincere, and when they talk about the firewall, and they have stressed that they will all step down before they would form a coalition with the AfD. So I kind of believe them, and I hadn't followed Olaf Scholz so much when he doesn't. And I think the danger starts when we see a generation of CDU politicians that come after this generation that is fighting right now for their survival. And if they were to fail, and if they were to step down, then we would be looking at a situation like we have in Moscow right now, where high-ranking members would consider forming a coalition with the AfD, I think.
In fact, that is the scenario you pretty much predicted, only that it took place in Austria, not in Germany.
You're right, yeah. And it was interesting when I wrote it in 2016. It was only 3 years after the AfD was founded, so it was very early, and it had an early stage. And it was so easy to just manipulate in my fiction the percentage points of the parties in Germany, and it was scary. I still remember the point while doing that, how scary it was when I made only little changes to the percentage points, how a situation unfolded where the other parties are not able to form stable coalitions, and the AfD becomes very powerful at only 28%, for example.
Yes, Matt, I want to pick up on that because at the moment the picture is very fragmented. There are three parties that may or may not make it into the German parliament. That means passing the 5% threshold. How would that change the whole equations of how difficult it would be to have a stable coalition here in Germany? Because a coalition it will be for sure.
I guess that just like there's so many different moving parts, and essentially you've got if this party gets in, then it makes a coalition more likely or more unlikely. I think what's really interesting about the situation we're in now is that because if one party gets in, then you could have a three-way coalition, a four-way coalition. But I think what Justus is talking about is, for me, is really fascinating because it's about like the fragmentation in the middle, and that's what this debate last week for me struck out was just there's so much loss of goodwill. Loss of trust by these parties that should, in a couple of weeks, sit down and form the next government. And that's where I feel like this was a turning point in German politics, because it wasn't just the vote, but it was also that the atmosphere was so unlike anything I've seen before. And I've watched and followed British politics where it's very rowdy. And Germany, I've always thought everyone thinks it's quite subdued and they're all very civilized. It was nothing like that. It was so toxic in the Bundestag last week that I feel like what Justus has written about in his book, I would love to know what you think, Justus, like whether we are now closer, whether it's the likelihood of an AfD coalition partner or a AfD being in coalition in the coming years is greater now than it was 10 days ago. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so what I did in 2016 was simply map out the worst case. So what we see right now, if we think, well, this is exactly what he predicted, well, then we are living in the worst case. And we are really facing a historic crisis of our democracy. And the future looks grim. And if we don't find some solution, and we haven't found a solution in the past 8 years, and then we are heading towards a much stronger AfD, and we are heading towards a scenario that is Austria right now.
But Justus, I would like to actually drill down on that one, because I wonder whether your feeling from the research you've done and your analysis is that the risk that Friedrich Merz took by confronting this in Parliament, actually accepting votes from the far-right AfD, which will be going into the German history books. And it was on the day that Germans were commemorating the Holocaust and the liberation of Auschwitz. So is the damage that happened there to democracy greater than what he may be able to prevent? Because his argument was, look, and his party's argument continues to be, some 20% of people are essentially left out of the political debate because nobody will go into a coalition with the far-right AfD. Mind you, the AfD has also been able to drive the political agenda quite a lot. So where do you see the damage here to democracy on balance?
I mean, we see in the polls that the damage for the CDU is not really substantial, or they even gained 1 percentage point. And that is really the important thing. If the CDU has a good result in this election, then we can have a stable government, and then we can solve the problems. And I think Friedrich Merz is really right about one thing. This is the last chance. This election, and it's not only about his party, all parties, they really have to get things right this time. And if they don't, we are looking at a very grim future. And if they do, they need a strong mandate from the people and really have to think of the seriousness of the moment. And I really think he was trying to put the issues first and say that I don't care what's in the government. The issues are in first place, and he's actually right about that, and he's not the only one saying it. So I think it's the only way of regaining trust from the people and it's the only way to solve the issues.
Matt, what do you think? Once these elections are done and dusted, when it comes to forming coalitions, do you think there will be a different tone? I mean, we did hear some really harsh words from the Social Democrats opening the gates of hell. I mean, incredible accusations there. Will they be able to climb down from that and go into a coalition together? The Social Democrats or the Greens even?
So I guess what people should know is that the CDU are basically going to have to go into government, it looks likely, with the Greens or the Social Democrats. If you're the Social Democrats, you might want to take a period of a pause from government, because they've been in government for so many years, and that's really just, I think, over the years has maybe damaged their ability to really define themselves differently and to get back to their basic issues, their bread and butter issues. So I think it looks like it would be the Greens maybe as the likeliest, but then you have this issue of whether, the CSU would be happy. This is the Bavarian sister party. You know all about them. Whether they would, I'll ask you, do you think we're going to get a black-green, a CDU-CSU coalition with the Greens?
I believe that it's still really open whether we will see a CDU-CSU, a conservative coalition with the Greens or the Social Democrats. Die Zeit has actually done a lot of different scenarios, and it looks on margin at the moment, according to this polling, more likely that we could once again see a grand coalition, which will be very different.
CDU, Social Democrats.
CSU with the Social Democrats, something Angela Merkel was in charge of for most of her time in office. But it would have a very different character, because you have the exact opposite of Angela Merkel now leading the Conservatives. And I think that is where the real change will lie, if you could see a similar scenario once again. So, we'll have to wait till February 23rd to learn what the voters actually say about this. But Justus, I just want to conclude with you and just ask you, where do you see us in your timeline in history? And how much responsibility is now on the shoulders of those who are in political responsibility on the 24th, just after these elections?
I mean, it would be easy to project that if nothing happens and if things stay the same, then we look at a future that is Austria right now, as I already said. But I think that there's one factor that we haven't talked about yet. Last year, when the LP, or the big scandal about remigration, ordinary German citizens rose up and marched in the streets. And it was not organized by parties. It was really ordinary Germans taking it to the streets. And this had a lasting effect on poll numbers of the AfD. And I think there's a big, huge difference if institutions won or if ordinary citizens, your neighbor, your colleague, your friend, march in the streets. And I think we have to keep in our minds when we do the equation that this could still happen, that ordinary Germans rise up, and this could have a lasting effect on the AfD. And so the talk about the strategy of the democratic parties is not the only thing that matters here.
And in fact, I mean, the parties of the current coalition and the Conservative opposition missed their opportunity to find an agreement over migration, which is the very issue that saved the far-right AfD party from political oblivion in 2015, when the so-called migration crisis happened and more than 1 million, mainly Syrians, came to Germany. Just a quick check-up with you. What is the mood in the AfD at the moment? How are they going into these elections, Matt?
I mean, I don't think they can really believe their luck that they've had this issue fall into their laps in the election campaign, because everyone's talking about the issue which they want to be talking about, and they're able, you heard Alice Weidel, the candidate for Chancellor. Everyone probably knows who Alice Weidel is. I don't even need to mention that now. You heard her after this vote. So on Friday, there was this really toxic debate. They had this vote on an amendment, which we talked about, to toughen some migration laws. And essentially afterwards, that vote failed because some CDU members didn't turn up. And she says, Friedrich Merz, there's the man who's promising you the earth. He said he was going to spring like a tiger, and in the end he was like a rug on the floor. So her point was, you cannot trust this guy. He's promising you he'll tackle this issue, but you won't get that. With me, you'll get real change. And I think that was that was the risk that he was taking in that week, was that essentially he was promising all these things, but if you can't get a coalition and other parties to back your policies, then people maybe then do turn to the AFD and say, well, why can't you work with the AFD? So I think for them, they're very optimistic that they will get their best result ever. And maybe one day potentially even enter government.
And the declared aim, of course, of the AfD from one of their co-founders, Alexander Gauland, was always, wir werden sie jagen. We will hunt them down, meaning the conservative CDU-CSU. And he's a former CDU member. So, Matt, thank you so much. Justus Bender, thank you very much for your analysis and your insights. Justus Bender from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung. That was Berlin Briefing for this time around on that firewall against the far-right Alternative for Germany, against cooperating with them. And you can find all of our Berlin Briefing episodes on your podcast provider on YouTube. And please do sign up for our weekly Berlin Briefing newsletter. We look forward to you tuning in again.